This week, the Pew Research Center released a new survey asking Americans about the Zimmerman verdict. The survey asked the question, does this case raise important issues about race that need to be discussed? It's kind of a soft question. But the answers reveal a deep racial divide. 47% of Hispanic respondents and 78% of black respondents believe that the Zimmerman verdict should provoke racial conversation. But only 28% of white respondents agreed. 28%. Fewer than 1 in 3 white Americans even think we have something to talk about here. But there is one high-profile white man who is willing to talk about race. And he spoke up on Fox News on Monday night.
You want a conversation? You got it. You want a better situation for blacks? Give them a chance to revive their neighborhoods and culture. Work with the good people to stop the bad people. Pumping money into the chaos does little. You can't legislate good parenting or responsible entertainment, but you can fight against the madness with discipline, a firm message, and little tolerance for excuse-making. It is now time for the African-American leadership, including President Obama, to stop the nonsense, walk away from the world of victimization and grievance, and lead the way out of this mess.
Well, that is one way to start a conversation. Michael?
Yeah, you know what's interesting to me? Why is it that when we say we want to have a conversation on race, you want to have a conversation on blackness? You don't want to have a conversation on race. You don't want to have a conversation on white privilege, unconscious bias. You don't want to talk about the collective world we've made as black, brown, red, yellow, and white people. You want to lecture black people. And by the way, Mr. O'Reilly, did you not hear? Even though a lot of us disagree, did you not hear President Obama tell Morehouse College no excuse making? Now, a lot of us want to put that in the
and Morehouse is not even the beginning of that. It's actually part of what makes President Obama in a particular position to say what he said a week ago, is that he has been very much the kind of respectability president from the beginning. Right,
and even if those of us who have problems with that, the point is, how can white Americans like Mr. O'Reilly ignore the context when Mr. Obama has lectured endlessly and tirelessly for African-American people? But beyond that, Jesse Jackson and Alvin Toussaint in the 1970s had a book called Why Blacks Kill Blacks. So please don't pretend that African-American people have not been on this case. But this is what we know. White-on-white crime is a devastation in America, like so-called black-on-black crime. It's not black or white-on-white crime. It's proximity murder.
Yeah,
people kill where they live. Yeah. So we have to talk about that in a broader sense. And guess what? The cameras don't show up in Chicago like they show up in Newtown and Aurora. All we're asking for is equal attention paid to crises at a time of enormous distress for our vulnerable children to be assisted. So, Mr. O'Reilly, I'd love to have that conversation about protecting yourself behind white picket fences and Fox News and having digital courage. Come in the streets where you went to Sylvia and you were surprised that black people don't throw bananas at each other or swing from trees.
Well, isn't this the problem, though, with the whole idea of the need for a conversation about race? It leaves it at the interpersonal level, so that if we could just communicate in a certain way, then suddenly all of these structural, policy, and institutional matters would be eradicated magically. So that that's also my issue with the whole privilege discourse as well, that it leaves it at this institutional level, so that if people were just nicer, would just own their privilege and treat people better at that individual level, that we would be doing a whole lot better. And I actually think that that leaves us without a pathway forward in terms of making institutional change.
But the point you made just came from conversation.
And this feels to me like, well, you know, this is part of the angst, is that we lack a certain kind of vocabulary, right? So that, for example, black-on-black crime is the easy thing to say because we all have some standard way of thinking, oh, we know what that is. But when you say white crime, that it's, I mean, that we don't even have a thing that is to fit that into.
It hits the ear wrong. The way people can't even understand it. But there's a reason, like when you say this whole conversation we're having right now about this idea of the conversation around race, how can you have a conversation around race when most of the country doesn't understand the very construct of race, and when they don't understand how this works in general, how its effect through history has these people in these situations, in these areas that literally, historically speaking, this is why they're there. And they don't understand that. So how can you get them to say, cool, so let's talk about privilege, let's talk about this? They're like, what are you talking about? No.
Congresswoman, I want to ask you about another person who weighed in on race in a bit of a different way today. This is one of your colleagues. There's a kind of rhetorical move as we move beyond black and white, but still around race. This is Republican Iowa Congressman Steve King. You've probably heard at this point, but let's listen one more time as he makes comments about young, undocumented immigrants.
For everyone who's a valedictorian, there's another 100 out there that they weigh 130 pounds and they've got calves the size of cantaloupes because they're hauling 75 pounds of marijuana across the desert.
Okay.
Wow. Steve King, first of all, should apologize. But then again, that's who he is. He's done this over and over and over again. And Melissa, I think these members of Congress and others, Bill O'Reilly, they're really trying to make sure that we don't engage in a dialogue by playing the race card or by trying to run the blame the victim kind of theory. You know, and that's just so tragic and dangerous because there's some people who believe this and act this out. What's important is I think we need to have this dialogue, but we need to understand we have to move beyond dialogue and we have to act, whether it's at the community level, at the business level, corporate level, in Congress. I mean, we're dealing with structural and institutional racism. And we're dealing with policies, for example, such as mandatory minimums, 3 strikes. You're dealing with these sequester cuts that are going to negatively impact communities of color. You're dealing with cuts across the board, Section 8. Who do they impact? They impact people of color in a big way. And so we've got structural and institutional issues of racism that must be swept from under the rug.
Jonathan, I want to push on this King argument for one moment. Let's listen to him because he doubled down. When you said he needs to apologize, he actually double down. Let me listen to double down for a second, then I have a question for you.
This is hands-on, eyes-on from the Border Patrol as well. And I got a call from them yesterday, and I said, do I need to come back down and refresh myself? And they said, no, you're spot on what you're saying, but maybe you got the weight 10 pounds up.
So he is insisting that this is an empirical reality. You talked before about this anxiety about not being able to see Latinos within the context of who they are with specificity, and that there's this question about are they going to be white or black, because that's the only binary that exists for us. And just accepting that premise for a moment, if there was a moment when Latinos could have been thinking, well, you know, we're going to go with whiteness because that seems to work out in America, right? And so to the extent that we can bring together the trappings of whiteness, we'll go with that. This feels like the rhetoric that is like, oh, okay, well, apparently we're not going to get to be white. So it actually generates a kind of political coalition that might not otherwise exist.
I mean, it's the great irony about the conservative effort to recruit Latinos to their movement, right? That they stumble over themselves by making these kinds of comments. But it speaks to the way that we need a new racial common sense altogether. I mean, the way that, so it doesn't measure out empirically. What Steve King is saying just doesn't work out empirically. And you see that people are rejecting this common sense, the Dream 9, the young people who are just rejecting our current way of thinking about immigration altogether. And we need a new way to reimagine what immigration could be. What would it look like to have a citizenship of the Americas, right? Lo and behold, what if we had new categories, new discourses, new ways of thinking about rights? And this is why it's connected to the conversation about the African-American experience, because these are joint experiences of exclusion.
Can I say that, but also what's interesting is that, you know, they've done all these studies so that when certain immigrants come here, they have notions of blackness, regardless of where they're from, so that they're very negative because they've imbibed and internalized unconsciously the poison that's been spewed from America. And then, you know, there's a huge difference between being a white Cuban from, say, Miami and a black Dominican from New York. So we know that internecine squabbles among Latino communities, all of which experience hierarchies of color as well. If Elian Gonzalez had been from Santiago de Cuba as opposed to Havana, he would have been sitting back with a Snickers bar saying, have a good time. But the contestation over whiteness operates within the context of, I think, Latino identity as well. And what you're pointing to is the seductive character of whiteness that increases its capital by saying, join with us, as opposed to joining with the black dimensions of Puerto Rico that we saw in that juror. I think that has to be articulated as well.
You know, it's such an important and difficult conversation. And the one thing I will say is, you know, the Fox MSNBC thing happens sometimes, but to the extent that legitimately, even if we have very different dialogues and discourses, even places we're coming from, there is a value in having interracial conversation. It is insufficient, but it is necessary. But the key with conversation is it has to be among peers. You don't have a conversation with somebody who has less power, like, I feel constantly frustrated by the fact that you can have a powerful medium like TV and still can't manage to have a conversation across those differences, and we're going to keep trying to push on that. I'm going to have a conversation, however, with Congresswoman Robin Kelly right after the break, only making the crisis of violence in that city even more urgent as a priority. And that's why the label emergency was applied to the National Summit on Violence in Urban Communities hosted by the Congressional Black Caucus for 2 days this weekend in Chicago. Among the attendees was the mother of 15-year-old Hydea Pendleton, who was shot and killed in a Chicago park a week after performing at the president's inaugural parade. Hydea's mother told MSNBC reporter Tremaine Lee her concerns now extend to her young son.
I have to do things and be boisterous to protect him before he gets to where he's going to go independently, walking down the street on his own with certain privileges and being misidentified, you know, as someone else or something else. Right now he's 11. Wow. But, you know, I don't, you know, the Martins have already suffered, and, you know, that's an awareness for the rest of us.
Joining me now from Chicago is Representative Robin Kelly of Illinois' 2nd Congressional District, one of the hosts of the summit. Nice to have you, Congresswoman.
Thanks for having me.
So talk to me about this. We've talked a lot about Chicago gun violence on this show, but what was the goal of this summit in particular?
Really, we wanted to go back to the people that live in the communities, the people that are doing the work, to see what their suggestions were. It's easy for some of us to say what should be done, but we really wanted to take it back to the neighborhood, to listen to the people that came to the summit, and also talk about some of the good things and good programs that are going on in the Chicago area.
So, Congressman, you know, I live in New Orleans, and we are also facing a rash of gun violence, although we've had some important declines over the past 6 months. The Zimmerman verdict has been distressing to me as a parent of an adolescent child, in part because, on the one hand, you feel like, okay, if I choose to live in a predominantly African-American community, to be near folks who look like me, and all of the cultural reasons to live in those communities, I'm also often opting into a community that has these kinds of violence issues. And then the Zimmerman verdict makes me feel like, and if I go in to opt into some sort of middle-class, predominantly white community, then I have that sort of danger of profiling. What are the folks who were at that summit saying about their sense of where they can live to have themselves and their children be safe?
You know, it's interesting because that, to my knowledge, wasn't talked about that much. What really came up a lot of times was, you know, what our kids need. We don't want our kids on the block, but as the youth was saying, but they don't have anything to do, that we've taken away the community centers. We don't have the resources. We need a youth initiative where we're putting our youth to work, at least during the summer, where there's internship programs, where adults are coming in caring about the youth, loving the youth, where parents are parenting. Those are more of the things that came up, like, what about us?
Hold for me just one moment. I want to come out to you, Professor Dyson. You actually had testimony here. What did you have to say? What do you think are the key things that ought to be driving our conversation around this?
Well, yeah, I had the privilege of speaking with Trayvon Martin's father there, and Kwesi Mfume and others. And it's extremely important to talk about the things that the right wing thinks we're not talking about. When you talk about Chicago, you're talking about depopulation. They lost 200,000 people, which means that you lose social capital, you lose jobs, you lose industry. Then you talk about the fragmentation of the gangs, because when you disperse the heads of the gangs, the body acts errantly. And it sounds ironic to say there's lack of discipline, and therefore they do drive-by shootings and the like. And then thirdly, we talk about the way in which there is a lack of attention paid to those who are at the bottom of the boat. So that depopulation and gang fragmentation has to deal with also the radical demoralization of poor people in this country. When you put all that stuff together, it's a powder keg and it's going off. And what I suggested is that we have, both from the White House down to everyday society, use the bully pulpit to say, continue to speak out against so-called crime in these areas, but also talk about resources. Neighborhood Youth Corps in Cedar, when I was a kid, you had a chance to get a job. And if you don't even have a chance to get a job, you don't know what it means to report to work, to make a decent wage, and to feel good about doing an honest day's labor. Those things together are common sense, but they also have a tremendously positive and edifying effect upon the populations about which we speak.
Congressman, one last question for you here. The other thing that we've covered a lot around Chicago has been the closing of the schools. Did young people at all talk about that in connection with the issues of gun violence in the city?
More of the adults spoke about that than the young people. The young people are just crying out for jobs, mentoring, adults who care, something to do, expanding community programs. That's what they really address. And they also address that as adults, we really don't know what the gang is these days, what the gang how gangs really operate. Something along the line of what Professor Dyson was saying, that it's very different. It might be block by block. It's not what we think it is or what it was before.
Right, and if we don't even have good definitions of what we're dealing with, it makes it very hard to be effective policymakers. Congresswoman Robin Kelly in Chicago, thank you for joining us this morning.
Thank you so much.
And after the break, what they call in hip-hop beef, and why Harry Belafonte is ready to squash it.